The room smelled like reheated casserole and old grief, that specific combination you only get when someone dies and the family gathers to decide what's left. My grandfather had been gone 3 weeks. 3 weeks was apparently enough time for my brother to park a brand new F-250 in the driveway of the house we grew up in. I drove over in the same '09 Silverado I'd been sleeping in for the past 6 weeks. I parked it at the curb so nobody would see the sleeping bag rolled up against the back seat, the duffel bag wedged behind the passenger seat, the gas station coffee cup I'd been refilling since Tuesday because I couldn't afford a new one. That's the kind of homeless nobody talks about. Not the kind on the news, the kind where you still show up to family dinners, you still shake hands and say you're fine and nod when someone asks how work is going. The kind where you brush your teeth in a Sunoco bathroom because the gym membership you'd been using for showers got canceled when your debit card kept declining, and you couldn't figure out why. Because the money was leaving your account every single month, right on schedule, like clockwork, like something you'd set up yourself and simply couldn't remember doing. I'd been making a payment of $400 a month for 2 years, a payment my mother told me I owed. She'd shown me a piece of paper, certified looking, with my grandfather's name on it. She said he'd gone into debt before he passed, that the shop was leveraged on a line of credit he'd taken out during a slow year. That family takes care of family, and my share of that obligation was $400 a month until it was cleared. She said it quietly, with that particular gentleness she reserved for delivering news she expected you to argue with. I didn't argue. I was 28 years old and I believed her, because that's what you do when you trust the people who raised you, when you've never had a reason not to. I walked into that house carrying nothing but my jacket and the low-grade nausea I'd been carrying for 2 years. The feeling that no matter how carefully I moved, the ground kept disappearing beneath my feet. My grandfather built his auto repair shop from a converted barn on Millbrook Road outside of Zanesville, Ohio 40 years ago. He started it with $3,000 and a floor jack he'd bought used and repaired himself before he ever turned a paying customer's wrench. He taught me to do brake jobs when I was 12. By the time I was 19, I was spending summers in that shop, instead of the corporate internships my brother called real opportunities. Grandpa called it apprenticeship. He said a man who knows how to fix things will never starve, and he said it the way people say things they actually believe rather than things they want you to believe. He told me more than once, standing over an engine with his sleeves rolled up and no ceremony whatsoever, that the place was going to be mine when he was gone. He said my brother had his accounting degree and his corporate trajectory and didn't need it. He said I'd shown up when showing up mattered. Those conversations happened in the specific way real conversations happen. Mid-task, unremarkable, certain. I was there. What I didn't know was that 18 months before he died, someone had convinced him, 81 years old, recently diagnosed with early cognitive decline, trusting of his own family, to grant a power of attorney. My father had been holding the pen. The estate reading was supposed to happen at the family attorney's office in town, but my mother had rescheduled it to the house. Cozier, she said. More fitting. What she meant was easier to control, easier to stage, easier to end when it needed to end. I sat in my grandfather's old armchair because no one else would. It still held the faint shape of him, still smelled like his aftershave and something mechanical I couldn't name. And I watched my brother arrange himself at the dining room table like a man chairing a board meeting. He had a manila folder. He had a yellow legal pad with notes I couldn't read from where I sat. He had his wife beside him with that careful, prepared expression she always wore when she already knew something bad was about to happen to someone else. My mother moved around the kitchen refilling coffee cups. Her movements smooth, practiced, the kind of hospitality that functions as a performance. My father sat at the far end of the table, with his hands folded like a man who has already arranged the outcome and is now simply waiting for it to arrive. Then the front door opened. My aunt walked in from Columbus. I hadn't seen her in 4 years. She was my grandfather's youngest daughter, the one who'd moved away 3 decades ago and was reliably described by my mother as difficult, dramatic, someone who made everything about herself. She was wearing a blazer and carrying a leather bag over one shoulder. Behind her walked a man in his 50s with a hard-sided briefcase and the expression of someone who deals in facts for a living and has stopped being surprised by what people do for money. She didn't apologize for being late. She didn't hug anyone. She looked at me first and something shifted in her face. Not pity exactly. Something more like relief, like she'd spent the drive over afraid I wouldn't be there. Then she looked at my brother. "We need to talk about what happened to the shop," she said. My brother's pen went still against the legal pad, just for a second, just long enough. My mother turned from the kitchen counter with a coffee cup and the wrong smile. "We're so glad you made it. There's plenty of time to go over everything. We were just about to get started." "We're starting now," my aunt said and pulled out a chair. The man with the briefcase sat down beside her and set it on the table without being asked. My brother cleared his throat. "I don't know who this is, but if he's not..." "He's a forensic accountant," my aunt said, "and a licensed notary. He's been retained by my attorney for the past 6 weeks. Sit down." My brother didn't sit. He stood with one hand resting on his folder, visibly deciding whether this was a room he could still control. My father said, "This isn't necessary." My aunt reached into her leather bag and placed a document on the table, not dramatically. She set it down the way you set down something that has always been true and simply needs to be seen. "That is a copy of Dad's will. The original was filed with the probate court the morning after he passed." My mother said carefully, "We have a copy of the will." "I know you do," my aunt said. "That's a different document." The sentence didn't land hard, it landed precise. I looked at my brother. He was staring at the document the way a man stares at something he was certain he'd already dealt with. My aunt looked at me and kept her voice level. "Dad told me what he wanted when I came to visit last spring. He told me other things too, that your father had been pushing him to sign paperwork, that he was confused sometimes, that he'd find documents in his files he had no memory of executing." She paused. "So we went to see an attorney together, just the two of us. He was evaluated for capacity by a physician he trusted. He executed a new will with 2 independent witnesses and a clear record of his intentions." She glanced at the folder my brother had been guarding all morning. "Whatever version of the will you're holding was superseded 11 months before he passed." My mother's voice went sharp and sweet at the same time, which was a combination she'd spent her whole life perfecting. "You have been out of this family for 20 years. You don't come in here and..." "His name is not in the document you filed," my aunt said, and she was pointing at me. "Did you know that?" I looked at my father. He did not look back. "According to what your parents submitted," my aunt continued, "the property on Millbrook Road was transferred to your brother 14 months ago via power of attorney, your father acting on your grandfather's behalf." She turned a tab page and slid it across the table toward me. "Look at the transfer date." I looked. 14 months ago, 8 months after my grandfather had been diagnosed, 6 months after my mother had handed me that piece of certified-looking paper and told me about the debt I owed. The forensic accountant opened his briefcase and set down a spreadsheet marked up in 3 colors. His voice was unhurried, entirely professional, the voice of a man who has said difficult things in difficult rooms and long since stopped bracing for the reaction. "The same week that property transfer was recorded, a loan account was opened in your name at a lender in Columbus. The account was registered to the shop address. Payments have been drafted from your personal checking account on the 15th of every month for 24 consecutive months." I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. "Those payments do not correspond to any legitimate loan. There is no underlying debt instrument. The funds were routed through 2 intermediary accounts and deposited into a joint checking account held by your brother and his wife." My brother sat down. He sat the way people sit when their legs stop working. $400 a month, 24 months. $9,600 that I had scraped together through doubles and skipped meals, and a landlord who eventually stopped accepting partial payments because what he needed was the full amount, and what I kept offering was evidence that I was trying. $9,000 I had paid with genuine belief, actual belief, the kind you don't examine because examining it would mean questioning the people who said they loved you, and every cent of it had gone directly into my brother's account. "There are also 3 credit accounts opened in your name," the forensic accountant said. He produced another folder. 1 credit card, 1 revolving line of credit, 1 utility registration, all established at 4417 Millbrook Road, all currently delinquent. The delinquencies began approximately 8 months ago, which coincides with the period when your rental renewal was denied, and your employment applications began declining at the final stage. My sister-in-law made a small sound. Her hands were flat on the table, pressing down, like she was trying to hold herself in place. I had prepared a different version of today. I'd practiced it in my head during the drive over. Something measured, something that didn't embarrass anyone, something that communicated I was working on it without making anybody have to respond to specifics. I'd planned to sit quietly through the estate reading and drive back to wherever I was going to park for the night and let the rest of it be what it was going to be. I said, I've been living out of my truck for 6 weeks. It came out very flat. Before that, I was on a friend's couch. Before that, I lost my apartment because my renewal was denied over late payments on a credit line I never opened. I looked at my brother, at the shop's address. He said nothing. Did you open accounts in my name? He said nothing. The delinquencies, the forensic accountant said, not looking up, account for a 112-point drop in your credit score over 18 months. That drop is consistent with the pattern of rejections you experienced in rental applications and financed equipment purchases. My mother said, this is getting wildly out of hand. It got out of hand 2 years ago, my aunt said. I spent 6 weeks reading records. What I found wasn't a family managing an elderly man's affairs out of love. What I found was a coordinated effort to strip someone of every asset and support structure he had so he couldn't ask questions, so he'd be too exhausted and too far behind to ever look up long enough to look back. My mother gripped the edge of the counter and said nothing. My father said quietly to the table, it wasn't supposed to be permanent. Don't, my mother said. I just mean, don't, she said again, hard. I looked at my father. He looked like a man who had rehearsed an explanation for so long he'd stopped being able to tell whether it was true. You needed me to fail, I said, because if I wasn't failing, I'd have time to ask where the shop went. I'd have the credit to hire someone to check records. I'd have a stable address, a real phone plan, enough margin to sit down and figure out why every opportunity I got close to collapsed. He opened his mouth. Tell me one bad decision I made, I said. Name one thing I did that justified any of this. He closed his mouth. My aunt produced the final document, a power of attorney in a clear sleeve handled like evidence. This is the document your father used to authorize the shop transfer. Our attorney had the signature examined. She placed it in front of me. That is not your grandfather's signature. I had seen his handwriting my whole life, on birthday cards, on work orders tacked to the corkboard above his tool chest, on the frame he'd made for my certification the year I passed my AC exam. He'd written my name in the corner in his particular blocky printing, each letter slightly separated, careful as a man who knew how much a name mattered. The signature on the power of attorney looked like someone had studied all of that and tried. Pen pressure, letter formation, the way he connected his surname. None of it matches 42 authenticated samples from the same 12-month period, my aunt said. The specialist's conclusion was unambiguous. My brother stood up. I'm done sitting here for this. Leaving before the notarized documentation is witnessed and logged will be recorded as an attempt to avoid service, the forensic accountant said, without raising his eyes from the folder. You can make that choice. My brother stopped in the hallway doorway. His wife said his name quietly, without any particular hope in it. He came back. He sat down. She spoke into the silence. Her voice had gone very small. He told me your grandfather had already agreed to everything. He said it was just paperwork. He said you didn't want the shop, that you'd moved on. She stopped, swallowed. I should have asked more questions. I know that. Her eyes moved briefly to my mother. My mother looked away. I had been called unstable twice in the past 4 years. Once by a manager at a shop where I'd interviewed 3 times and then been passed over after what felt like a guaranteed offer. Once by my mother when I called her at midnight from a parking lot to say that my debit card had been declined 4 times, and I didn't understand what was happening to my account. I'd carried the word for years like a diagnosis I didn't remember receiving. I'd started to wonder if maybe the problem was something internal, some flaw in my wiring that made stability impossible, that made good things fall apart the moment I got close to them. It wasn't a flaw, it was a design. My aunt made 2 phone calls from the kitchen, brief and professional, one to her attorney, one to the county non-emergency line because her attorney had been clear. If the signature fraud is documented on site, call it in before anyone can disappear into a back room and start deleting files. My mother called it an ambush. She said the word loudly twice, as if saying it enough would make it true. My aunt said, "An ambush is a surprise. You've had 2 years to stop." The deputy arrived in under 30 minutes. By then, my brother had offered 3 different versions of events, each one slightly more exculpatory than the last, each one slightly less coherent. His wife had stopped talking entirely and was sitting with her arms folded around herself, looking at a point on the wall past everyone's head. My father was very still. My mother was washing dishes, which was the most her thing she had ever done in my presence, performing normalcy as the walls came down around her. I sat in my grandfather's chair and answered every question the deputy asked. I was steady. Not because I wasn't shaken, I was shaken in the way you are when you realize the story you've been living wasn't yours. It was written by other people, for other reasons, and handed to you as your biography. But I was steady because for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't the one who had to prove anything. The proof was on the table. All I had to do was be present for it. My aunt sat nearby the whole time and didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She just stayed. That was enough. That was more than I'd had from anyone in a long time. The shop was returned to me by court order 41 days later. I drove out on a cold Tuesday morning, with frost still on the grass, and stood in the parking lot for a while before I could make myself go in. The bay doors were padlocked. The sign my grandfather hung in 1987 was still up there, faded, letters slightly uneven, because he'd hung it himself without a level, because he'd said if it's crooked, you just rotate your head a little. Inside, the lift was where it had always been. The old tool chest he'd bought secondhand before I was born was against the far wall with his handwriting on a strip of tape along the top drawer. "Do not bow what you won't return." I put my hand on the hood of the car still sitting in the bay, the one he'd been working on when he got too sick to continue, and I didn't move for a while. My brother entered a plea agreement. Identity theft and wire fraud carry real consequences when you have routing records, IP addresses, a forensic accountant's affidavit, and a handwriting specialist's report. His wife cooperated and was treated accordingly. The civil case against my parents for the diverted payments is ongoing and will take longer than I have the patience to follow week by week. My aunt filed a separate action on my grandfather's behalf, posthumously, because she said he deserved to have it on the official record that someone stood up for him after he was gone. I reopened the shop 4 months after the court order. I hired one mechanic and we worked the bays together, the same way my grandfather and I used to, which means mostly in comfortable quiet broken up by the specific language of the work. I fixed the drainage issue in Bay 3 that Grandpa had been meaning to address since the late 90s. I repainted the exterior in the same color, because some things don't need reinventing, they just need someone to keep showing up for them. The Silverado runs fine now that I have the time and the resources to maintain it properly. There's no sleeping bag behind the seat. There's a thermos in the cup holder and an invoice book on the dash and a schedule that makes sense from one week to the next. My grandfather told me a man who can fix things will never starve. He meant it practically, a skill, a trade, a floor that doesn't disappear beneath you. But he was also saying something harder and more true than that. He was saying the work itself is worth something, that what you build with your own hands belongs to you in a way that paperwork can complicate, but not ultimately take. That showing up day after day in the cold or the heat or the middle of a life that doesn't seem to be going anywhere is its own kind of proof. He was right about all of it, and it turned out he'd spent the last year of his life making sure I'd get the chance to find that out.